What if I told you that the main enemy of settlers in the Wild West was not armed bandits or wild animals? The real threat awaited them every night inside their own homes, when the sun disappeared behind the horizon and the temperature dropped rapidly. The most dangerous place in a pioneer's cabin was the floor, which by morning would turn into an icy trap capable of destroying health and even life. In conditions where snowstorms raged outside the thin walls and firewood was often in short supply, sleep became a daily test of survival. They had to invent incredible ways to stay warm, turning everyday objects into life-saving tools. Watch the video to the end to find out how an ordinary potato could save your toes from frostbite and why old newspapers were more valuable to vagrants than gold. What if I told you that the comforts of home we take for granted were an unattainable luxury for the first settlers? The biggest problem with any log cabin or hut on the frontier was the floor, which often became a conduit for deadly cold. Most of the first dwellings had no floor at all, and people simply walked on compacted earth. Despite its simplicity, the earthen floor had the terrible property of drawing heat from any object that came into contact with it. Even if a fire was burning in the hearth, the temperature at ground level could drop below zero, causing the water in buckets to freeze. Those who could afford wooden flooring used so-called planks, logs split in half and laid flat side up. These rough boards rarely fit tightly together, leaving wide gaps between them. Through these gaps, cold air constantly flowed into the living quarters from the crawl space, where an icy wind blew. The cold accumulated at the bottom, creating an invisible but palpable pool of icy air half a meter above the floor. Sleeping on such a surface was equivalent to lying down in a snowdrift, so the main task was to get as high as possible. That is why the first beds of the pioneers were tall and cumbersome structures resembling scaffolding. The bed frame was often built directly into the corner of the house, using the log walls as support to save wood. The legs were made of thick logs, raising the sleeping area to the level of an adult's waist. This elevation allowed them to be in the zone of warmer air, which, as we know, rises upward. There was free space under the bed, which was never empty and was used to store chests and utensils. The bed itself was made of intertwined ropes or rawhide straps stretched between the sides of the frame. These ropes had to be tightened regularly with a special wooden wrench as they sagged over time. The rigid mesh served as a base for the mattress, but did not provide any warmth itself. It was merely an engineering trick that allowed one to physically distance oneself from the icy source below. However, even at such a height, the cold from the walls continued to penetrate to the bone, requiring additional protective measures. Lone hunters and trappers who spent the night in temporary shelters could not always build a high bed. They had to use spruce branches, laid in a thick, springy layer directly on the snow or frozen ground. This layer created an air cushion that insulated the body from direct contact with the cold surface. The thicker the layer of branches, the greater the chance of waking up in the morning healthy and able to continue on the journey. It was a primitive but effective method borrowed from indigenous peoples. Sometimes in the harshest conditions, wooden boxes filled with dry leaves or moss were used. A person would literally bury themselves in this box, creating a thermos effect around themselves. The walls of the box protected against drafts, and the filling retained the heat emitted by the body. It was like sleeping in a large nest, where comfort was sacrificed for the sake of survival. Such methods took time to prepare, but in the wild, rushing could be too costly. In more inhabited houses, the space under a high bed was often closed off with thick curtains or boards. This was done not so much for beauty as to reduce the circulation of cold air under the sleepers. The result was a kind of insulated compartment where the air was slightly less mobile and, therefore, less cold. Sometimes dogs were allowed to sleep under the bed at night, their bodies serving as living heaters. The fight against the cold began with an understanding of simple physics. Contact with the floor kills. Every 10 centimeters of height above ground level added precious degrees of warmth. The pioneers quickly learned that low bunks were a path to pneumonia and rheumatism. Their sleeping places were their fortresses, towering above the icy sea that covered the floor of their dwelling. I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on such Spartan conditions. Could you sleep on a rope net at -30 degrees? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about what was really hidden inside the beds that generations slept on? We are used to soft spring mattresses and orthopedic foam, but for the pioneers, a tightly stuffed tick was the limit of their dreams. A tick was a large bag made of thick cotton fabric that matched the size of the bed frame. This bag was the main element of the sleeping system, and the quality of sleep and the amount of heat retained depended on its filling. The most common filling for such mattresses was ordinary straw left over after threshing grain. Straw was available, free, and had good thermal insulation properties due to the tubular structure of the stems. Fresh straw smelled pleasantly of the field and created a high, elastic layer in which one could settle comfortably. However, over time, the stalks broke down into dust and the mattress became hard and lumpy. Therefore, once a year, usually after the harvest, the contents of the tick were completely shaken out and replaced with new ones. An even more popular material, especially in the South and in corn-growing areas, was dry corn husks. They were carefully selected, dried, and torn into narrow strips to make the filling softer and more uniform. Corn leaves were more durable than straw and held their shape better under the weight of the human body. Such a mattress could last for several years, requiring only periodic fluffing through a special slit in the fabric. However, corn mattresses had one significant drawback that is rarely mentioned in novels. They made an incredible noise with every movement of the sleeper, rustling and creaking with dry leaves. If the whole extended family slept in one room, any turn from side to side by one person would wake up everyone else. It took months to get used to this sound, perceiving it as an inevitable background noise of nightlife. On the other hand, this filling provided excellent insulation from the cold coming from below. For those who wanted more comfort and warmth, there was an elite option: a goose or duck down feather bed. Collecting down took years. Housewives plucked live birds at certain seasons, collecting soft undercoat gram by gram. A feather bed was not just a mattress, but a real family asset, which was passed down to daughters as a dowry. It was incredibly warm, as the down created thousands of microscopic air pockets that retained body heat. But even owners of luxurious feather beds often placed them on top of a rough straw mattress. The straw underneath served as insulation from the cold air and drafts coming through the rope mesh of the bed. The down provided softness and enveloping warmth on top, creating a sandwich effect. This combination was considered ideal for harsh winters, when the temperature in the house could drop below zero by morning. Caring for such bedding was hard physical labor that fell on the shoulders of women. Every morning, the mattresses had to be beaten and turned over so that the filling would not clump together and lose its properties. On sunny days, the beds were taken outside to air out to get rid of dampness and odors. It was a never-ending battle to preserve the volume and elasticity that determined the warmth at night. In addition, natural fillings attracted unwanted guests who sought warmth just as much as humans did. Small rodents could gnaw through the ticking and make a nest right inside the mattress, among the straw. Therefore, regular inspection of the bed was a mandatory ritual before bedtime to make sure you would be sleeping there alone. The use of dry herbs such as wormwood or lavender helped repel insects and created a pleasant aroma. Sleeping on a straw or corn mattress is a special art that requires skill. You had to be able to make a small depression, a nest, in the center and not slide to the edges. If the mattress was stuffed too tightly, it turned into a rounded hill from which it was easy to fall. If it was too loose, the body sank down to the hard ropes of the frame. These simple bags filled with plant debris were the only barrier between a person and the icy breath of the night. They rustled, pricked, and required constant care. But without them, survival in winter would have been impossible. Could you sleep to the loud crunch of dry corn leaves? I will reveal the most closely guarded secret that allowed survival in the open steppe without firewood or coal. In the Great Plains, where there was not a single tree for hundreds of miles around, it was impossible to build a classic log cabin. Here, the pioneers turned to the experience of the indigenous peoples and nature itself, creating dwellings that used the earth as the main insulator. Dugouts and sod houses became a symbol of ingenuity, where the soil itself acted as a giant heat accumulator. The principle of such dwellings was based on the geothermal properties of the soil. At a depth of 1.5 meters, the temperature of the earth remains relatively constant throughout the year, without freezing in winter or overheating in summer. Pioneers dug pits directly into the slope of a hill or dug into the flat surface of the steppe. The walls of such a house were infinitely thick because they were served by the planet itself, reliably protecting against the piercing winds. The roof of the dugout was made of a thick layer of turf, layers of grass intertwined with roots, cut like bricks. This green ceiling had phenomenal insulating properties, keeping the heat inside the room. In winter, when blizzards raged outside and temperatures dropped to critical levels, the dugout remained at a stable above-zero temperature. A small hearth was enough to heat the space to a livable temperature. In such houses, the floor was often left earthen, but it was carefully tamped down and covered with a layer of clay mixed with ash. After drying, this mixture became as hard as concrete and could even be swept. The clay floor, being below the level of soil freezing, was itself a source of relative warmth. It did not freeze the feet like a wooden floor in a ground house exposed to all winds. Thick walls made of turf, laid with the grass facing down for better adhesion, played a special role in thermoregulation. The width of such a wall could reach a meter, which created an insurmountable barrier to the cold. During the day, these walls slowly accumulated heat from the stove or the sun shining through small windows. At night, when the fire in the stove went out, the walls began to release the accumulated heat back into the room, smoothing out temperature fluctuations. Inside such dwellings, a special microclimate with high humidity was always maintained. This was beneficial for the respiratory tract in the dry climate of the steppes, but required a constant battle against mold. Nevertheless, humid air retains heat better than dry air, which was an additional factor for survival. People lived in essence inside the living organism of the earth, breathing and warming them with its heat. To sleep in dugouts, niches were often made directly in the earthen walls, covering them with skins or blankets. Such a sleeping place, surrounded on all sides by soil, resembled a cozy burrow. Body heat was retained much better in such a confined space than in a large open room. It was psychologically difficult, but physically the warmest way to spend the night. Of course, life in a dugout had its drawbacks. Earth could fall from the ceiling, and the roof leaked when it rained. But in the bitter cold, when the mercury in the thermometer froze, it was these primitive burrows that saved thousands of families from certain death. They were warmer than the much-vaunted wooden houses, which were drafty through the cracks between the logs. This experience of using the thermal inertia of the earth was later applied in the construction of vegetable storage facilities and ice houses. But initially, it was a survival technology for people who had nothing but a shovel and the endless steppe beneath their feet. Sod houses proved that sometimes a step back to a cave-like existence can be a step towards salvation. Thanks to this method, settlers were able to survive winters that killed livestock left out in the open. The earth was their blanket, their wall, and their stove. This ingenious use of natural laws is still admired today. Don't forget to like this if you were surprised by this technology. Guess how much the only blanket capable of defeating death in the icy steppe weighed? When ordinary woolen blankets and patchwork quilts proved powerless against the Arctic cold, nature came to the rescue. The main treasure and lifeline for any frontier dweller was a bison hide, or as it was called, a buffalo robe. This hide was not just an everyday item, but real armor against the cold, unmatched by any man-made material. The bison hide had unique properties. Its thick, curly fur created a dense air layer that perfectly retained heat. The bison skin was thick and durable, completely windproof, working like a modern membrane. One such skin could weigh more than 10 kilograms, and covering yourself with it was like covering yourself with a heavy carpet. But it was this weight that gave a feeling of security and pressed the edges tightly together, preventing cold air from blowing under the blanket. The secret to using bison hides was to position them correctly. Experienced trappers and Native Americans always placed one hide with the fur facing up under themselves and covered themselves with the second hide with the fur facing inwards. This created a cocoon in which a person was sandwiched between two layers of thick fur. The lower skin insulated against the cold of the ground or bed, and the upper skin reflected body heat back. Even in the most severe frost, the temperature inside such a cocoon remained above zero. Trappers who went into the mountains to hunt often used the double skin tactic to sleep directly on the snow. They wrapped themselves in a huge skin with their heads inside, leaving only a tiny hole for breathing. Moisture from their breath settled as frost on the outer pile, creating an additional crust that sealed the heat inside. In the morning, they had to break this snow cocoon from the inside to get out. Tanning hides was a complex and laborious process, mainly carried out by tribal women or the wives of settlers. An improperly tanned hide became as stiff as plywood and broke in the cold. A high-quality robe was soft, elastic, and could last for decades, being passed down from father to son. A good skin was expensive, but on the frontier it was valued more than money. In addition to bison, bear, wolf, and even sheepskins were used, sewing them into large sheets. Bear skin was considered particularly warm and waterproof, but it was much more difficult and dangerous to obtain. Sheepskin was more accessible to farmers. Sheepskins were sewn with the fur inside, creating primitive sleeping bags. Such a bag was cramped, but it allowed you to warm up with your own body heat much faster. Interestingly, old skins with worn-out fur were not thrown away. They were used to cover doorways and windows, creating additional barriers against drafts. Bald patches of skin were rubbed with fat to maintain elasticity and windproof properties. Every piece of skin was used to insulate the home. In families where there were not enough skins for everyone, they were placed on top of ordinary blankets as a finishing layer. The heavy leather pressed down on the light patchwork blankets, preventing them from slipping, and created an impenetrable dome over the sleepers. Under such pressure, the children slept motionless but warm, heated by their collective breath. Unfortunately, with the extermination of the bison, this invaluable resource began to disappear, forcing settlers to look for a replacement. But in the golden age of Western expansion, it was the shaggy giant of the prairies that gave people the opportunity to survive the night. The bison blanket was a symbol of status, experience, and a chance for survival. Could you fall asleep under the weight of a 10-kilogram hide smelling of wild animals and smoke? When external insulation was not enough, pioneers used active heat sources that they placed directly in their beds. This method was a lifesaver in homes where the walls were almost completely frozen through. It made the cold nighttime space more tolerable and turned sleep into something resembling rest. People knew that without additional heat, it was almost impossible to fall asleep. Therefore, these tricks became a daily necessity. Even children participated in preparing for the night by helping to gather materials. It was a simple but effective way to turn a cold bed into a cozy place before going to sleep. Pioneers valued such solutions for their accessibility and reliability. No one needed to buy expensive things. Everything was made from what was at hand. Simple objects took on new meaning when it got cold. Every evening turned into a small ritual of fighting the cold. This is how the culture of home warmth was formed. The most common heat accumulators were ordinary river stones or bricks, which were turned into heat accumulators every evening. These items were everywhere, so they were considered the best solution for poor families. Stones retained heat well and withstood daily heating. Bricks were also reliable helpers, especially if the house was built from them. People quickly learned to choose stones of the right size. This method of heating became commonplace. The process of preparing for bed began long before lights out. The family usually gathered around the hearth to prepare the night heaters. The hostess estimated in advance how much heat each person would need, depending on the weather. Sometimes it was necessary to heat not 2, but 5 stones. During cold weeks, this ritual was repeated daily. Everyone's comfort at night depended on it. The hostess placed several large smooth stones or burnt bricks on the edge of the hearth or in the oven. This stage required attention because some stones heated up too quickly, while others heated up slowly. The stones had to be turned over in time to heat them evenly. This was often monitored by children who were learning the intricacies of the task from adults. Preparing the stones became part of the evening routine. It brought the family together around the fire. The stones had to be thoroughly heated, but not red hot so as not to burn the laundry. Only experienced housewives knew this delicate balance. An overheated stone could have terrible consequences and destroy all the family's possessions. Therefore, women constantly checked the temperature with their hands from a distance. Such control required skill and caution. Without it, heating the bed was dangerous. It required experience and attention, as an overheated stone could cause a fire. Even a small spark could lead to disaster in cramped wooden houses. People understood that they had to follow the rules to preserve their homes. Therefore, they always used only proven methods. Sometimes neighbors shared recommendations on how best to heat the stones. Such an exchange of experience was an important part of community life. Heated objects were never placed in bed uncovered. This was an unwritten rule that everyone followed. An uncovered stone could burn or scorch fabric in seconds. Therefore, any object was carefully wrapped and checked. Only then was it allowed to be placed under the blanket.
Sleep well.
The perfection of this method saved people from injury. They were carefully wrapped in several layers of old flannel, wool, or even newspaper. The thicker the layer of fabric, the slower the stone cooled. Such wrapping allowed the heat to be stretched out for many hours. Old or unwanted items were given a new lease on life thanks to this purpose. Fabrics were selected specifically for hot water bottles. Every home kept such rag blanks. This wrapping served a dual purpose. It protected the feet from burns and slowed down the release of heat, causing the stone to stay warm longer. People discovered this in practice when they tried different materials. Thin fabrics did not retain heat, while thick ones made the heating weak. Therefore, a delicate balance was required. Each home found its own ideal option. It became a small science. The bundle was placed at the foot of the bed under the blanket half an hour before bedtime to warm up the cold sheets. During this time, the bed became much softer and warmer. People waited for the warmth to spread throughout the entire length of the blanket. Sometimes 2 bundles were made for children to warm them up faster. This created a feeling of care and tranquility. The warmed bed became an oasis for the night ahead. So-called soapstones, talc chloride, were especially popular. This stone was mined in certain places and was considered valuable because of its ability to retain heat for a long time. It was soft enough to be shaped into a comfortable form. People often passed such stones down as heirlooms. They were considered family treasures. Talc chloride was a real luxury. This mineral had unique heat capacity, was easy to work with, and stayed warm for a long time. Even a small bar could give off heat for hours. It was kept in the oven longer than ordinary stones to achieve the perfect heat. Such stones were used most often in winter. They were especially valuable in harsh climates. The warmth they provided was considered almost magical. What if I told you that the habit of sleeping in a hat was not a fashion statement, but a matter of survival? We are used to seeing nightcaps in cartoons or old fairy tales, but for frontier people, it was a critically important item of clothing. In a cold room where the air temperature was not much different from the outside temperature, the head was the only part of the body not covered by a blanket. Heat loss through an uncovered head could be enormous, leading to hypothermia of the entire body. Nightcaps were made of soft wool, flannel, or thick cotton. Men's models often had a long conical end with a tassel that could be wrapped around the neck like a scarf. Women's caps fit snugly around the head, covered the ears, and were tied under the chin to prevent them from slipping off during sleep. This simple headdress created a microclimate around the head and protected the ears from frostbite. Sleepwear was generally multi-layered. No one undressed completely. A long nightshirt made of brushed flannel was worn over underwear. Flannel was the ideal material, soft, warm, and absorbent. Thick woolen socks were a must, sometimes even 2 pairs. People often slept in their daytime clothes, loosening their belts only if the cold was unbearable. But the most effective way to keep warm was to use collective heat. The concept of personal space disappeared in winter. 3, 4, or even 5 people often slept in one bed. Children were laid across the bed at their parents' feet or in tight rows, like sardines in a can. The warmth of their bodies stacked together created a powerful heater capable of withstanding any frost. There was a custom of bundling, when even guests or suitors could sleep in the same bed with the hosts, fully clothed and separated by a special board or pillow. This had no sexual connotations, but was a harsh necessity. Leaving a guest to sleep alone on the floor meant condemning them to illness. Warmth was a resource that had to be shared. Before going to bed, it was essential to do physical exercises to get the blood flowing. Jumping, rubbing your hands and feet, and doing quick squats all helped you get into bed already warmed up. Going to bed cold was a mistake. A cold body could not warm up a cold bed, and you risked shivering until morning. They covered themselves head to toe, leaving only a small tunnel for air to enter. This allowed them to breathe warm air and not lose moisture. However, by morning, the blanket in the breathing area was covered with a crust of frost from condensation. Shaking off this frost was the first task in the morning. Such closeness during sleep strengthened family ties, but also contributed to the rapid spread of colds. If one person got sick, everyone got sick, but there was no choice. Loneliness in an icy house was deadly dangerous. A nightcap, woolen socks, and the warmth of a loved one's shoulder nearby. These were the three pillars on which the pioneers' sleep rested. These people knew the value of warmth and knew how to preserve it with every thread of their clothing. How comfortable do you think it was to sleep in a cramped pile of 5 people, even if it saved your life? Once the bed was prepared and the body was warm, the main problem remained: drafts. Log cabins, as romantic as they may seem, were full of cracks. The wood dried out, settled, and gaps formed between the logs, through which the wind blew away precious heat. The process of sealing the house, called chinking, was a never-ending battle for airtightness. The gaps between the logs were filled with whatever was at hand: wood chips, small stones, dry moss. On top, this filling was covered with a mixture of local clay mixed with sand, straw, or animal wool for binding. This mixture hardened, forming a windproof barrier, but the clay cracked and fell out in the rain and frost. So every autumn the house had to be caulked again, going over it centimeter by centimeter. The walls were often covered with old newspapers from the inside, if they could be obtained. Paper glued in several layers with flour paste served as an excellent insulator and protected against the wind. The text of the newspapers became the only entertainment and wallpaper for the family during the long winter. In the poorest homes, burlap or simply old rags were used, which were stuffed into the cracks with a knife. Windows were another weak spot. Glass was expensive and rare, so window openings were often covered with oiled paper or translucent animal skins. Such glass let in dim light, but did not retain heat. At night, the windows were covered with heavy quilted blankets or skins, completely blocking the opening. The floor was covered with homemade rugs woven from strips of old clothing. Rag rugs covered almost the entire floor area, creating a layer between the feet and the icy boards. Hay or newspapers were often placed under the rugs for additional insulation. Walking on such a floor was softer and, most importantly, warmer. Carpets, blankets, or simply pieces of fabric were often hung along the walls. This technique, known since medieval castles, created an additional air chamber between the cold wall and the room. The fabric blocked drafts and made the room visually and tactilely warmer. The living room was transformed into a soft box upholstered with textiles. Doors were also insulated with fabric rolls placed under the threshold to cover the gap at the bottom. This roll was called a draft snake. The door itself was often covered with felt or leather so that it fit more tightly against the jamb. The attic, if there was one, was filled with dry leaves, sawdust, or earth. The heat rising upwards should not escape through the roof. A thick layer of insulation on the ceiling was as important as warm walls. Sometimes hay for livestock was stored there, which served as excellent insulation for the residents below. All these measures turned a leaky log cabin into a relatively airtight dwelling. It was a constant job, filling cracks, fixing carpets, tucking in cushions. The house demanded attention and care, rewarding it with the chance to survive the night without frostbite. The heart of the house and the main source of life was the stove or fireplace. However, the open fireplace typical of early buildings was extremely inefficient. Most of the heat, up to 90%, escaped up the chimney along with the smoke, and the room was heated only by the infrared radiation from the fire. Your face could burn from the heat while your back froze. The appearance of cast iron stoves, which gave off heat over their entire surface, was a real revolution. At night, the main task was to keep the fire going until morning without getting up every hour to throw wood on it. To do this, they used a technique called banking the fire. In the evening, before going to bed, the coals were raked into a dense pile at the back of the stove or fireplace. They were covered with a thick layer of ash. The ash blocked the oxygen supply, and the coals did not burn with an open flame, but smoldered slowly inside, retaining their heat. A large wet log, called a night log, could be placed on top of this structure. It slowly dried and smoldered throughout the night, maintaining a minimum temperature in the firebox. In the morning, the hostess only had to stir up the pile, allow air to enter, and the fire would flare up again from the remaining coals. This eliminated the painful procedure of lighting a fire with frozen hands in an icy house. The stove was placed in the center of the room so that the heat would spread evenly. They tried to lay the pipe as long as possible inside the living space before bringing it out onto the roof. The hot pipe acted as an additional radiator, giving off precious heat to the air rather than to the street. Clothes and shoes were often dried around the pipe. Sometimes heat reflectors were used, sheets of polished metal or simply tin installed behind the stove. They reflected infrared rays back into the room, protecting the wooden walls from overheating and directing the heat towards people. It was simple physics in the service of comfort. In severe frost, the stove was heated hot, red hot before bedtime. However, this was dangerous. An overheated pipe could cause a fire. Therefore, one of the adults often slept with one eye open, monitoring the condition of the stove. A fire in winter meant certain death on the street, so fire was treated with reverence and fear. Anything that burned was used as fuel. In the treeless prairies, they used cow chips, dried patties of bison or cow dung. They burned with a hot, even flame without odor, if they were dry, and smoldered for a long time, which made them ideal for nighttime heating. The preparation of these chips was the responsibility of the children. They also burned tightly twisted bundles of dry grass, corn cobs, and even sunflower stalks. Each type of fuel had its own burning characteristics that had to be known. The ability to control fire, to make it burn long and economically, was the main survival skill. The first thing in the morning was to check the fire. If it had gone out, it was a disaster. You had to go to your neighbors, sometimes several miles away, for hot coals or try to strike a spark with a flint, which was not easy to do with frozen fingers. Fire was life in the most literal sense. For those who had no home, hobos, itinerant workers, cowboys on the move, the strategy for spending the night was quite different. They were constantly on the move, and stops were only brief rests between long journeys. They did not have the opportunity to light a stove or heat the walls as farmers or settlers did. Every evening they had to find a new safe place to spend the night. Therefore, they developed keen observation skills and the ability to quickly assess their surroundings. Their survival skills were honed over many years, with each night teaching them a new lesson. They couldn't heat the walls, so they had to create micro-shelters. These were simple structures that could be assembled in minutes from materials at hand. On cold nights, such shelters could mean the difference between life and death. People accustomed to the road knew that even a little protection from the wind saved energy. They used whatever was available to improve their sleeping conditions, even if only slightly. Thus, an initiative based on pure necessity was born. One of the most surprising insulators was ordinary paper. It could be found almost everywhere and weighed nothing. Vagrants quickly realized that paper could retain heat, even though at first glance it seemed useless. Newspapers could be found in trash piles at train stations, near shops, and even along roads after market days. People collected every page they found, knowing that it could save them on a cold night. Paper became an important part of their modest equipment. Old newspapers found at stations or in the trash were incredibly valuable to vagrants. Newspapers were so important that they were cherished almost like clothing. Many even exchanged found items for a few pages. For the hobo, it was a versatile material that served as both bedding and insulation. Newspapers were never thrown away unless absolutely necessary. They were a real currency among people on the road. The secret of the newspaper lay in its layered structure. The many thin sheets created air pockets that trapped body heat, preventing it from escaping. This effect was similar to that of modern insulation, but much simpler and more accessible. This feature made the newspaper the ideal protection against the biting wind. Even a small bundle under clothing made a real difference. People appreciated the simplicity of this technique. Several layers of paper placed under clothing or tucked into trouser legs and sleeves provided excellent wind protection and retained body heat. This made it possible to survive even nights when the temperature dropped below zero. Vagrants knew that it was important to close all the gaps through which the wind could penetrate. Properly laid paper reduced heat loss so much that it became a real lifesaver. Such insulation was free but priceless. It helped to preserve life in harsh conditions. A hobo blanket was often just a stack of newspapers under which they slept on benches or in freight cars. People covered themselves completely with them, like a cocoon, leaving only their faces exposed to breathe. In the cars, the paper protected against the metal cold that penetrated through. On the street, it saved them from the piercing wind. Despite its fragility, the newspaper worked surprisingly well. Many recalled that the newspaper warmed better than thin blankets. The paper worked better than a cheap thin blanket, creating a thermos effect. It retained a layer of warm air around the body and did not let the wind in. Vagrants were often surprised at how effective this simple invention was. Sometimes they even shared newspapers with each other if they saw someone suffering from the cold. This mutual understanding helped them survive. The newspaper became a symbol of cunning and mutual aid on the road. In the forest, travelers used dry leaves. They were available almost everywhere where trees grew. The leaves could be gathered quickly, and the amount depended only on how hard one worked. They were soft, dry, and retained heat well if gathered in a large enough pile. Many vagabonds knew in advance the good places with a thick layer of leaves. It was a natural insulator that required nothing but time. They raked up a huge pile of leaves and literally buried themselves in it, head first, like animals. This created a dense cocoon that almost completely blocked out the cold air. Inside such a shelter, it became surprisingly warm. Travelers could warm up in just a few minutes. This method required courage and practice, but it was incredibly effective. Many people saved their lives this way. A thick layer of foliage, at least half a meter deep, insulated them from the ground and retained heat. The ground, especially when frozen, could take away heat faster than the air. Therefore, protection from it was critically important. Foliage creates air pockets that slow down heat exchange. The thicker the layer, the longer the body heat was retained. All experienced vagabonds knew this. Foliage became a nighttime refuge from the cold. Their survival depended on their ability to use trash in nature. They found value in things that others considered useless. Newspapers became blankets, leaves became pillows, and fire became protection. Such ingenuity helped them survive where others would not have had the strength. The vagrant life required flexibility and courage. Newspaper, an armful of leaves, the right place for a fire. These little things made up the life of a person who had no roof over their head. Mornings in the pioneer's house did not begin with coffee and the news, but with an assessment of the damage caused by the cold. Waking up was often accompanied by the sight of frost on the blankets. The frozen breath of sleepers crystallized overnight. The first sound was not an alarm clock, but the chattering of teeth and the crunch of snow under the boots of the owner going out for firewood. The water in the bucket standing in the corner of the room was usually covered with a thick crust of ice that had to be broken with a ladle or even an axe. It was a vivid demonstration of what had happened in the house while the stove was cooling down. Washing with ice-cold water was a shocking procedure that instantly dispelled sleep but tempered the character. Clothes taken off in the evening turned into a hard, cold shell overnight. Putting on frozen pants and a shirt was a test of willpower. Often, clothes were placed under the blanket a few minutes before getting up to warm them up a little with body heat. They tried to place their shoes closer to the stove, but not too close, so that the leather would not dry out and crack. Breakfast was prepared in coats and hats until the stove warmed the room again. Only when the air warmed up could the family afford to take off their outer clothing. This cycle, from evening warmth to nighttime cold and morning struggle for fire, was repeated day after day, month after month. Psychological resilience was as important as physical resilience. The constant cold was exhausting, causing apathy and depression, known as cabin fever. The ability to get up every morning, break the ice, and start a new day required iron discipline. Those who gave up and allowed themselves an extra hour of warmth risked neglecting their duties and freezing to death. Children quickly learned this harsh rhythm. Complaints about the cold were not accepted because everyone was cold. This shaped a special generation of people, resilient, unpretentious, and able to appreciate the slightest comfort. For them, warmth was not a right, but a privilege that had to be earned. Despite all the difficulties, these icy mornings remained in the memory of many as a time of unity. The joint struggle against the elements brought families closer together than any wealth could. They knew that as long as they had firewood, matches, and each other, they would survive another winter. The history of frontier settlement is not just about gunfights and gold rushes. It is a story of a quiet, daily war against the cold that was fought in every home every night. Straw mattresses, hot stones, bison hides, and earthen walls were the weapons in this war. The ingenuity and resilience of these people allowed them to settle in lands that seemed uninhabitable. They learned to sleep on ice and wake up alive. And this feat deserves no less respect than the exploits of Western heroes. What other topics related to the daily life of the pioneers would you be interested in learning about? Perhaps how they stored food without refrigerators, or how they treated teeth without dentists? Please share your suggestions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories about the real Wild West.